Over again, we hear the media stating how many people have tested positive for COVID-19. The problem is that this makes no sense at all. Today I'm going to explain why as we dig deeper into PCR tests once again and have a look behind the curtain of this COVID pandemic. The purpose of using tests in clinical medicine is to distinguish between having or not having a particular condition or disease. For example, is a patient with chest pain having or not having a heart attack? Is a woman who missed her period pregnant or not? But a test and a condition are not the same thing. I've never had a woman come into my clinic and say, I think I might be positive for pregnancy. She either has a positive or negative pregnancy test and her condition is either pregnant or not pregnant. All tests detect something. Let's call it the object of interest. And most go further and determine how much. For example, we may check the blood concentrations of glucose and cholesterol. These are direct tests, meaning the object of interest is the test. But there are many indirect tests where what is being measured is a reliable surrogate for the object of interest. For example, when you have a heart attack, a doctor will measure an enzyme that leaks from your damaged heart muscle cell rather than chopping out a piece of your heart muscle to examine it under a microscope. Some tests, such as home pregnancy tests, are classified as positive or negative. Pregnancy tests become positive at a certain threshold of hormone being detected in the urine, which have been reliably established over a long period of time. We use indirect tests because they are simple, safe, quick, and cheap. But indirect tests have a caveat. Before they are introduced into routine clinical practice with real patients, it is absolutely essential to determine how well they match the object of interest. There are long-established scientific methods for doing this. Obviously, this involves evaluating the test against the object of interest whose presence or absence is determined independently of the test. So now that we've established the rules, let's get into COVID-19. The mainstream theory is that a new virus called SARS-CoV-2 is the cause of a new disease called COVID-19. The test for SARS-CoV-2 is not for the whole virus, the complete sublight microscopic particle itself. Perhaps most familiar is this computer-generated image we see on the news. The test is supposed to detect a 1% fragment of an RNA molecule, its genome, said to reside inside the virus particle. Based on its detection, a person is deemed infected with the virus SARS-CoV-2 because this tiny fragment is regarded as de facto for 100% of the virus's RNA. It could be seen as finding a horse-like hair as evidence of the horse itself. This is problematic for three reasons. First, while there are many papers revealing the existence of the viral RNA and the presence of coronavirus-like particles on electron micrographs, there are none proving that the RNA comes from inside those particles. In fact, there is now a €225,000 prize for proof of isolation of the virus in its contained genome. Second, because no test is 100% reliable, the RNA detected by the PCR may not be the 1% of the viral genome. Third, since there are no reports of RT-PCR evaluated against the virus itself, no one knows how many people who test positive for the virus are actually infected with the virus. It's like we've found the horse here but can't say anything about the horse or the jockey. Not a good situation, but this is what happens when scientists, for whatever reasons, cut corners and ignore the basics for establishing test parameters. The detonator for the worldwide explosion of so-called COVID-19 PCR testing was the Corman-Drosten Group paper published on 23rd of January 2020. Incredibly, the paper was accepted for publication within 24 hours of submission, and several authors failed to declare their financial conflicts of interest with a commercial PCR test lab. Also, somewhat unusually, version 1.0 of the paper protocol appeared on the WHO website 9 days before the paper was even accepted for publication. But the Corman-Drosten paper was just a lab study, meaning it didn't establish the validity of using the test in the real world. No evidence was provided about how a positive test related to the condition of COVID-19. As I've discussed in previous videos, this wasn't the only problem with this paper, and on the 26th of November 2020, a consortium of health professionals and scientists sent a retraction request letter to Eurosurveillance outlining their multiple concerns. I believe they are still awaiting a response. Back in January 2020, however, it was too late, and a test that had no track record was promoted to the world as the best way to diagnose COVID-19. When the mainstream media and government scientists started telling the public that the COVID-19 PCR tests were 95% or 99% accurate, it was not made clear to the public what that actually meant. In New Zealand, for instance, the Ministry of Health website stated, and this is in February 2021, that a recent laboratory study found that different COVID-19 testing kits correctly detected COVID-19 in samples more than 95% and frequently 100% of the time. This statement is problematic for many reasons, including confusing COVID-19, the condition, with SARS-CoV-2, the alleged virus. The RT-PCR does not test for COVID-19 in samples, and if correctly detected means accuracy, the latter cannot be determined without first evaluating the true positive and true negative rates of the RNA test for infection with SARS-CoV-2. But this has never been established. What is detected in a sample is not COVID-19. What is detected is a small piece of RNA. So it seems likely that the Ministry of Health has confused the analytical specificity of the test with its diagnostic specificity for the condition. Analytical specificity in this case is how well the test can accurately detect a target RNA sequence. So if a SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR kit has 100% analytical specificity, it tells you that it never picks up the wrong RNA molecule. But you can't get too excited, because that's like saying that your blood glucose test never picks up your blood cholesterol. What we need to know is the diagnostic specificity, which is the probability that the test will be negative when the condition is not present. For example, a pregnancy test that has 100% diagnostic specificity would mean we expect all non-pregnant women to test negative. Therefore, even if a SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR kit has 100% analytical specificity, it is still meaningless as a test for viral infection without proof of the diagnostic specificity determined against the virus. And this has never been established at all. It has been amazing to see in recent times that some virologists have turned into chemists under the spell of PCR. I was stunned to hear Australian Professor of Virology, Bill Rollinson, make the following statement last year on a broadcast.
With basic science and improving diagnostics and the ability to sense a molecule, and after all, a virus is just a piece of RNA molecule.
Interestingly, after he made the statement, none of the panel of experts joining him on the broadcast even called him out on this. Maybe this was just a slip-up on the professor's part, but this sort of thing could be adding to the confusion. So it's important that those of us that respect logic and the scientific method will not allow analytical specificity to be merged into diagnostic specificity and then passed off as valid medical practice. However, the lack of formalised clinical diagnostic criteria for COVID-19 seemed to allow the sleight of hand to be hidden in plain sight. I made a video titled, "What is a COVID-19 case?" in late 2020 addressing this very issue. In my presentation, I show that the WHO's official document states that a confirmed COVID-19 case is a person with laboratory confirmation of COVID-19 infection, irrespective of clinical signs and symptoms. This was a bad look for the WHO because it openly admitted that cases were not required to be related to disease. Just 3 days later, they removed the statement and published a completely revised document. While the new version looked more scientific, essentially nothing had changed, as a confirmed case could still be a person with a positive nucleic acid amplification test. So any old positive PCR test will do. To add to the smokescreen, the WHO website released another PCR update on the 20th of January 2021, stating the assays are indicated as an aid for diagnosis.
Yes, what you see. Iceberg, right ahead! Thank you.
On 11th of November 2020, the COVID-19 PCR tests hit some of their first major legal problems. Judges in the Lisbon Court of Appeal delivered some decisive rulings, including, in view of current scientific evidence, this test shows itself to be unable to determine beyond reasonable doubt that such positivity corresponds in fact to the infection of a person by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That I can certainly agree with. They also said the test reliability depends on the number of cycles used, which is being far too generous because No diagnostic specificity was ever established, so cycle thresholds are meaningless in this regard as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that reducing cycle threshold requirements for a positive case wouldn't be a good start. It's likely that a cycle threshold of, say, 25, down from the 40 cycles typically being used, would result in such a dramatic decrease in cases that panicked policymakers would be forced to concede that they've been swept up in a PCR pandemic. With regards to even 36 or 37 cycles being classified as positive for COVID-19, PCR expert Professor Stephen Buston stated back in April 14, 2020, "It's absolute nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever." From his point of view, once you get above a cycle of about 35, that would be roughly equivalent to a single copy of target RNA. And with a single piece of RNA, it would be absurd to conclude that a person is infected. I really encourage...
This goes on a little while longer, but I'm going to interrupt it here. I think we've heard enough to realize that this thing is just not very reliable. Okay, thank you.